Hello and welcome to LSAT Logic Applied. I'm your host, Andrew Leahy, an assistant teaching professor of law at Drexel Klein School of Law. This is a short format podcast where I take the tools from LSAT logical reasoning, assumptions, flaws, causation, strength, and weaken, and apply them to real-world claims in the news, science, and public discourse. For those that don't know, the LSAT is the law school admission test, a standardized exam designed to assess logical reasoning, analytical thinking, and reading comprehension for law school applicants. It's a high-stakes test with a unique focus on how arguments work and how they fall apart. The LSAT is owned and administered by the Law School Admission Council, or LSAC. I don't claim any affiliation or ownership. I'm just here to teach the logic. You don't need to be studying for the LSAT to follow along. The point is to learn how to spot weak or incomplete reasoning in everyday life, the same kind of reasoning the LSAT trains you to attack under time pressure. Today's episode is about necessary and sufficient conditions, one of the most foundational LSAT concepts, and how it shows up in the EPA's decision to rescind the 2009 greenhouse gas endangerment finding and eliminate federal vehicle greenhouse gas standards. Here's what's happening in more detail. In 2009, the EPA issued what's called the Endangerment Finding. Under Section 202A of the Clean Air Act, the EPA must regulate emissions from new motor vehicles if it determines that these emissions cause or contribute to air pollution which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. The 2009 EPA concluded that greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide meet that standard. That finding became the legal trigger for regulating vehicle greenhouse gas emissions. Now, fast forward to today. The EPA has rescinded that endangerment finding and eliminated greenhouse gas standards for vehicles from model years 2012 through 2027 and beyond. The agency's reasoning is not just scientific, it's legal. It argues that Section 202A does not authorize EPA to regulate greenhouse gases in the way prior administrations did, particularly for global climate change. It relies heavily on recent Supreme Court cases like West Virginia v. EPA and Loper-Bright, which emphasized limits on agency authority. So the central dispute is this. If greenhouse gases endanger public health, does that automatically authorize and require EPA to regulate them under Section 202A? That is a classic necessary versus sufficient condition problem. So let's formalize the logic and break down the claim. The Clean Air Act says, if emissions from motor vehicles cause or contribute to air pollution that may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare, then the EPA shall regulate those emissions. Structurally, that's if A, then B. If endangerment is found, then regulation must follow. In 2009, EPA concluded A is true, therefore B follows. The new EPA is not primarily arguing that greenhouse gases pose no risk. Instead, it argues something narrower. That even if greenhouse gases contribute to climate change, Section 202A does not authorize EPA to regulate them in this manner, especially when the policy consequences are vast and global. That introduces a subtle but crucial shift. The statute appears to treat the endangerment finding as sufficient to trigger regulation. The rescission suggests it may be necessary but not sufficient, because there are additional constraints on agency authority that must also be satisfied. On the LSAT, that's exactly where alarms should be going off. Let's use an LSAT lens for the claim and apply the LSAT framework. So first, necessary versus sufficient conditions. A sufficient condition guarantees the outcome. If A is sufficient for B, then whenever A happens, B must happen as well. The statutory structure looks like this. If endangerment finding, then regulation required. That treats endangerment as sufficient. But the rescission effectively says endangerment may exist, but that alone does not establish authority. That means the agency is inserting an additional unstated condition, something like endangerment plus clear congressional authorization for climate regulation, then lawful regulation. On the LSAT, when someone treats a condition that looks sufficient as though it were merely necessary, that's a red flag. If the statute says if A, then regulate, and the agency says A is not enough, then we need to know why. There's a second thing going on here. There may be a hidden premise. The rollback relies on a premise that is not in the statutory text. Major policy questions with sweeping economic consequences require clear congressional authorization. That principle comes from the Supreme Court's major questions doctrine, but notice what's happening logically. The statute gives a trigger, the court imposes a limiting principle, the agency now reads the trigger as constrained by that principle. On the LSAT, that's a classic example of inserting an additional condition into a conditional rule. If the statute says if A, then B, and someone says not necessarily unless C is also true, then the real argument depends entirely on C. So how would we strengthen the rescission? You would need to show one of two things. First, that Section 202A was never meant to address global atmospheric phenomena like climate change, and that the phrase air pollution was historically limited to local or regional pollutants. Or second, that the major questions doctrine overrides the apparent sufficiency of the endangerment finding by requiring a clearer delegation from Congress. In other words, you must show that the statute's conditional structure was never as simple as it looked. How would you weaken the rescission? You emphasize the text. Congress specified a condition. The agency found that condition satisfied. The statute uses mandatory language, shall regulate, and on that reading, the endangerment finding is not merely necessary, it is sufficient. If that's correct, then the rollback looks like an agency declining to carry out a statutory command. This is exactly the kind of move the LSAT tests relentlessly. Is the condition actually sufficient, or has someone quietly reclassified it as necessary and added a new requirement? It's not really a scientific dispute, it's a logical one. This episode isn't about climate policy, it's about structure. When you see an argument that says, yes, that condition may be met, but that doesn't mean the outcome follows, your LSAT training should activate. Ask, was the condition presented as sufficient? Has someone added a new requirement? Is the shift explicit or implied? Necessary versus sufficient condition confusion is one of the most common flaws on the LSAT, and it shows up constantly in statutory interpretation, administrative law, and constitutional disputes. If you can spot when someone quietly transforms a sufficient trigger into a merely necessary one, you're thinking like a lawyer and like a higher scorer on logical reasoning. And thanks for listening to LSAT Logic Applied. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more short episodes where we apply clean logic to messy real-world claims. See you next time.